Welcome back to The Rancher's Voice, the podcast where the heart of agriculture meets the pulse of today's industry. From policy changes to pressing issues, The Rancher's Voice dives into the stories that matter most to ag producers.
In each episode, we will cover topics including legislation, leadership, and the agricultural lifestyle. So be sure to subscribe to The Rancher's Voice everywhere podcasts are featured. If podcasts aren't your thing, watch us on the Montana Stock Growers YouTube channel.
Welcome back to the Rancher's Voice podcast. My name is Cheyenne Leach. I am the Communications and Programs Coordinator here for the Montana Stock Growers Association. And today we have Dr. Tahnee Szymanski, who is the Montana State Veterinarian, to speak with us and give us an overall livestock update, as well as just speak with our members. So thank you so much, Doctor, for joining us today and taking some time out of your busy schedule.
Absolutely. I'm happy to sit down and have a conversation.
I know that you have spoken to our members as well as our team multiple times throughout the years, as well as just all over the state. So if you could just, before we start, give us a little background on yourself and kind of give us some information about how you got started and even how you ended up in the position as state veterinarian.
So I'm a Montana native. I was actually born and raised in Helena, so didn't end up too very far from home. I did not grow up with a livestock background, but at a young age got enough exposure to cattle, pigs, and horses to know that it was something that I loved. So I did an animal science degree at Iowa State University and then veterinary school at Oregon State. Had the opportunity to come back home and do large animal ambulatory practice for a few years, and then kind of stumbled into working for the department many years ago under the initial traceability program here in the state. Ended up staying with the department for quite some time. So I've been here for almost 16 years now, served as the assistant state veterinarian for many years. What's it been, a year and a half now, and Dr. Zalewski moved on to a new position, had the fortune to be selected to be the state veterinarian as his successor.
But so I was just wondering if you could go in a little bit more on that traceability axis, as well as just kind of give us an overall livestock update. What can producers keep an eye out for? What's kind of happening in the industry right now that we should be aware of?
Yeah, so lots of potential updates, I think, to include. Certainly on the traceability front, that's one that's occupied a lot of time, attention, and maybe stress for people. Over the last couple months, as USDA announced in April of 24 that they would be finalizing their proposed rule on transitioning to a requirement that all official ID in the U.S. be electronic. That rule was finalized on November 5th or 6th. And so I think for the state of Montana, it's something that we felt a little bit more maybe acutely than other states that don't do as much brucellosis vaccination and brucellosis testing. So the rule did not just impact animals that are moving across state lines, but animals that have any sort of program testing done, brucellosis, TB, and then the big one here in Montana is calf foot vaccination. It didn't change which animals need official identification. It only changed the type of official ID that those animals are receiving. So the orange metal clips that so many of us are familiar with for brucellosis vaccination can no longer be used. Silver metal tags for cows moving across state lines also are off the books. And so with this transition, USDA had been historically giving Montana an allocation of no-cost RFID tags. That was roughly in the 200,000 tag realm. However, our tag use here in Montana is typically closer to about 500,000 tags a year. So we certainly are feeling the pinch associated with that, a gap between what we use and what we've been allocated. We've transitioned now into federal fiscal year 25. None of those tags are yet available to states, and so we're finishing out the last of our tag allocation for 24, waiting for Congress to pass a final budget so that we can start moving into next year's allocation and working to continue to put pressure on USDA that 200,000 tag allocation is not enough. We try to provide tags to livestock markets in Montana as well as to accredited veterinarians across the state, with a little bit of emphasis in the DSA just to make sure that we're covering those population of animals that required to be tested as part of our brucellosis program. Other animal health updates that I think are worth mentioning. One is on the brucellosis front. We have had a good year. We've seen steady testing throughout the DSA. Our annual review of compliance with DSA regulations continued to show really strong compliance. We certainly appreciate the kind of support and adoption that program receives from industry. We've worked on a handful of slaughter traces this year, so animals that mostly have traveled out of state, had blood collected at the time of slaughter, and then came up with a non-negative test. By the time you get those test results, everything on that animal has moved forward in the production system, and so you can't go back to it, which means you have to go back to the ranch of origin. We've had, 4 traces in Montana this year that had us testing herds outside of the DSA. We have one of those that will be wrapping up here in the next month or so. We're trying to get one little additional group of animals that will move to slaughter for a test. But all of those are coming up negative, so exactly as we would kind of hope and expect to see for herds outside of the DSA. Within the DSA, just the 2 kind of longstanding affected herds that we've had. So a nice quiet year in regards to brucellosis. I think one of the things that we certainly continue to struggle with the brucellosis program is the cost of that program, similar to the pinch in tags that we've had, allocation of no-cost tags from USDA. We did also see some funding cuts last year from the federal government for one of the programs that we use to pay for our brucellosis program. So we're trying to kind of get through to the next fiscal year. So we're always looking at budgetary discussions as it pertains to brucellosis. And then maybe the topic du jour has been HPAI, which normally when we talk about HPAI, we're talking about poultry. And even though there aren't any confirmed cases in beef cattle, the diagnosis of the disease in dairy cattle over the last year certainly has us all kind of paying close attention and spending a lot of time on what the implications of those detections are.
Just with that update in itself, what are some signs that we can look out for?
When it comes to the brucellosis program, a few of the challenges maybe that I've noticed pretty substantially over the last year and a half is, one, we use our knowledge of where wildlife, in particular serologically positive wildlife, are on the landscape to set our boundaries for our DSA. So based upon where primarily serologically positive elk are, because of the controls that we have in place for Yellowstone National Park bison, that really dictates the boundary of our DSA and which animals are subject to surveillance. We work with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks every year on a live elk capture, typically along the perimeter of that DSA, to look for, is it expanding outwards? Is there new wildlife movement patterns that might be putting additional populations at risk? This year in 2025, we did a capture in the Southern Crazies, and those 52 animals were captured. All of them came back negative for brucellosis, so that's really great news for that area. It was challenging to pull off that capture this year, and I think that some of the areas in the state that we would like to see live elk captures we're starting to face some unique challenges. One is we're getting into areas where there are smaller landowner parcels. And so when you're talking about using a helicopter, wildlife on the landscape, that presents a challenge as far as not running wildlife through fences and doing a lot of damage. We're starting to get into areas of Montana where the primary land ownership isn't individuals that are involved with the livestock industry. And so they might not want someone capturing elk because they consider it to be harassing livestock. And then maybe the third category is folks within the livestock industry that don't want to be within a boundary of a DSA, and so they would rather not know. And for some of those are challenges that I think we're going to have to find unique solutions going forward. I think for the last one in particular, I think it's really important for the integrity of our program and what we kind of go out to the rest of the country with as far as the strength of our program is that we do have the correct population under surveillance because we have not moved a positive animal out of our DSA, because we have not found a positive animal outside of our DSA in Montana. I think that really speaks to the strength of the program, and it gives our trading partners a lot of confidence in receiving Montana livestock, so that the only thing that they have to comply with is our regulations, and they're not dealing with a smattering of import requirements from other states. On the budgetary challenge, the cost of administering the program, we spend a lot of money paying for testing, reimbursing veterinarians and producers to offset the impact of being involved in that program. That's expensive. Landowners, cattle owners in the DSA don't have a lot of tools that are available to them to protect themselves. Through Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, they can take advantage of money for fencing to try and create a landscape that isn't so alluring to bring wildlife in. There's hazing opportunities, and then through some hunting, they might be able to disperse animals away from areas where livestock are raised. But the voluntary annual whole herd test is really the best tool that a producer has to control their fate, and we want to see producers doing that. It's how we find the disease earlier. It's how we limit the amount of time that a herd is under quarantine. It's how we make sure that folks can go to grass in the summer when they need to go to grass. It limits the scope of an epi investigation. Like, I can go on and on and on about the benefits of it. It really is, like I said, that's how they can control their own fate. But that's costly. And so, finding creative approaches to making sure that we're still maintaining our level of testing and that we're using the money that we have as efficiently as possible is something that I think will continue to struggle with going forward, especially if we see kind of an expanding range of seropositive elk on the landscape that causes us to bring additional herds into that surveillance program.
Switching focus into the HPAI that we spoke of previously, could you go into depth of kind of the challenges that we're facing with that and what that's looking like on a Montana spectrum, but all together update?
Sure. HPAI is a big beast of a topic. I think I could probably talk for 6 hours straight and maybe still not touch all of it. So just to try and give kind of a quick summary of where we are. We started in this outbreak in 2022, initially detections in wild birds, and then we started seeing it in poultry flocks. We went through approximately 2 years where we just kind of had ongoing detections in poultry flocks, including some here in Montana. I think we're sitting around maybe 16, 17 total detections in Montana since the onset of the outbreak. HPAI is an influenza A virus. It is potentially zoonotic to people. It is a disease that potentially can get into other species as well. And so we really want to make sure that we're doing things to minimize the risk of introduction to poultry flocks, as well as limiting the amount of virus that's on the landscape so that we don't see mutations and changes in that virus that can make it more infective to people or other animals. As we have moved through this outbreak, in April of last year, the big announcement of the diagnosis in dairy cattle down in the Texas Panhandle region, and then it moving across the country, that genotype, you'll hear it called the B313 genotype, spread laterally through movement of animals, movement of equipment, movement of people, ways that we don't maybe fully understand. At the time of that detection and up until a week ago, we were dealing with a single point of introduction from wild birds to dairy cattle. And then, like I said, we moved it around the country. That virus was very concerning because we were seeing it be able to be reintroduced back into poultry and cause the same disease in poultry that required us to respond, quarantine, depopulate flocks. And that's one of the things that over the last 60 to 90 days, in particular in California, has really decimated their poultry industry. As a result of that, as well as kind of a creeping number of human cases over the last couple of years, CDC, FDA, USDA have really been pushing the conversation about how we respond and what we can do to protect human health and protect our different sectors of our livestock and poultry industries. We know that this is not a food safety issue. Safely, properly handled animal protein that is handled safely and cooked appropriately is completely safe. Pasteurized milk is completely safe for consumption. The only human cases, or overwhelmingly the human cases that we have, are associated with people that have been working in an environment where infected dairy cattle or infected poultry are. So it's not, generally speaking, a substantial risk to the public. That being said, we can't kind of continue this cycle forever. And so there's been conversations about how to maybe get out of this cycle, in particular with the variant that has been in dairy cattle. So we started the National Milk Surveillance Testing Strategy. And I'm not sure how many states are up to participation now, but I think we're around 60% of the dairy industry in the U.S. is now under surveillance and increasing. Montana is 2 months into a surveillance program here in Montana where we're testing all of our licensed dairies. Everything in Montana has been negative. It seems like as the virus has moved through the California dairy industry, that it's starting to maybe slow down. We're not seeing as many new detections. And so the question is it going to burn itself out on the landscape or what comes next? Interestingly enough, however, through that milk surveillance testing, we've found a new dairy in Nevada. And it was just announced here in the last day or so. But when they went back and did testing at that dairy, they found an increased number of animals in the sick pen, reports of drops in milk production, but that genetic sequencing has it back to the wild bird variant and not the dairy variant. And so now we have a second introduction into dairy cattle, and we're not yet sure what that means, what the significance of it is. So where we're sitting right now is, one, there's a substantial conversation nationally about, is it time to employ vaccination, and whether that's vaccination of poultry or vaccination of cattle is maybe still to be determined. It will have additional impacts in regards to trade. But like I said, after what we saw in California, our poultry industry can't survive with this still on the landscape. In addition, I think we'll see some additional surveillance of milk, dairy cattle in particular. And then kind of the wild card that was introduced over the last couple of weeks that doesn't necessarily touch our livestock industry here in Montana, but certainly has impacts, is the detection of the virus in domestic house cats and in big cats in like big cat sanctuaries. As they have done the epi trace back on these, some of them have been associated with the consumption of raw milk. Some of them have been associated with the consumption of FDA inspected raw pet food diets. And some of them have been associated with somebody donating like a turkey that was purchased at a grocery store and donating it to a big cat sanctuary, which provides some concern that maybe there is the HPAI virus in our food supply, which really reinforces the need to practice safe handling and cooking practices, but also is something that we thought we were avoiding because of the severity of disease in birds and how quickly they get sick, that we didn't think we were moving animals that were shedding the virus. And so USDA has implemented some new controls for birds that are moving to slaughter. All of that to say that I think generally speaking, for producers here in Montana, we don't think that it would have the impact that it does to beef cattle that it does in dairy cattle. But certainly if folks are seeing evidence of, atypical respiratory disease, some of these animals are being reported as having diarrhea. It doesn't seem like they're producing milk as we're getting back into calving season, and when we'll have a lot of beef cattle lactating. It might be worth having a conversation with their local veterinarian or calling our office. We know that it's either going to be spread through lateral movement of animals, so being careful about what we introduce onto our operations, which is good practice in general, and then wild birds. And so if you don't have a lot of wild birds in proximity to your operation, I think that there's probably a safety level there. But if that a combination of clinical signs and the presence of large numbers of wild waterfowl in particular, like I said, it may be worth having an additional conversation. I think that generally speaking, we're pretty safe here in Montana, other than maybe our poultry operations, just because of the way our industry, kind of the natural flow of animals here in Montana. I think our risk of introduction is maybe a little bit less than, some other areas of the country.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the overall update, but also going in depth on some concerning issues. But that wraps up this week's podcast. So thank you so much for meeting with me and just joining us today. For our listeners, make sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. We post weekly for our updates for Capital Edition as well as the Rancher's Voice. Make sure to stay up to date with MSGA. Feel free to contact our office with any questions. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you next week.